In this video, we're going to talk about how to make an argument and what goes into making an argument. If you think about a house for a moment, a house can be made of bricks, it can be made of wood, it can be made of stone. Those are the things that go into the house. But then there's also the skill of building, right? How do you actually get the bricks to stack and adhere to one another? How do you get wood, or two pieces of wood, to adhere to one another? Maybe you use a nail, maybe you use a screw, and that's the how of it. So that's what we want to look at today. What goes into making an argument, and how do you do that? And we're going to go back to our old friend Aristotle, who really had something neat to say about all of that. Aristotle helped us understand that there are three acts of the mind that lead to three building blocks of categorical logic. And I really think this is cool because all of this just comes from out of up here. All of this just comes from you and from me thinking. And as we go through this, I hope you realize what an amazing thing the human mind actually is, that it can create and understand just out of its own inner workings. So you want to make a couple of columns in your notes. A column for acts of the mind, and a column for building blocks of categorical logic. And as always, as we go through these videos, if you need to pause them, go back, rewind it a little bit, do that so you make sure you get all of the information. So the first act of the mind is what we call simple apprehension. Simple apprehension simply means perceiving something with one of the five senses. So even though we're talking about the mind, we start off by thinking about the five physical senses, which allow us to bring information into the mind. So simple perception is just perceiving something with one of the five senses. Take a look at some examples. So in this picture, we have the little fellow in blue up on the left-hand corner there, and he's using the sense of sight. And he sees a car, and he thinks car. And at that point, there's nothing else that goes on in his mind. When that visual image hits his eyes, it just simply registers car in his mind. Same thing with the girl down below, bottom left corner there. She's using the sense of touch, and she reaches out and she touches that fabric, and her mind registers silk. So it's just a simple apprehension. The guy in the top right corner, he smells something using the sense of smell there, and he perceives perfume. Again, that's the only thing going on in his mind. And then the little fellow in green at the bottom right there, he's using the sense of hearing, and that horn goes off, but the thing that he perceives is simply noise. And you may have noticed that there's one sense missing. It's obviously the sense of taste. Well, golly, that takes us to our next picture. Yeah, there's the dragon, and he's eating all those people. And using his sense of taste, he simply registers the sensation, tasty. Okay? So simple apprehension is just perceiving something with one of the five senses. And just by doing that, that brings us to the first building block of categorical logic called the term. A term is simply what you perceive with one of your five senses. So if we think back to that picture, the guy seeing the car, the term is car. The girl feeling the cloth, the term is silk, right? That's what she perceived. Same thing with perfume or noise or tasty. Simple apprehension simply takes in something from one of the five senses, and that immediate impression, that sense impression, we call that a term. And that's the first building block of categorical logic. But then the human mind goes on from there. And after simple apprehension, we usually make some sort of judgment. And you see that judgment is making a relationship between two terms. So once you have apprehended something with your five senses, and you have some terms in your head, then you can start to make a judgment and make a relationship between or among those terms. So going back to our picture, the little guy sees the car, he has the impression of car, and maybe he also has the impression of red. So now he has two terms in his head. And now he can put those together and he makes the judgment, the car is red. Same thing with the girl in gold. She has felt the cloth and maybe she's registered two things, two terms. She's registered silk and she's registered smoothness. And so now she can make the judgment, silk is really smooth. Same thing for the fellow in the top right corner. Using his sense of smell, he perceived or apprehended perfume, and he perceived the sensation of niceness. And now he puts that together and makes the judgment, perfume smells nice. Same thing with the guy in green. He uses his sense of hearing. He takes in the sound of noise, and it also registers in his mind loudness. And so he puts that together and says, the noise is loud. And unless you thought that reasoning was only for people, apparently dragons can reason as well. And the dragon has the sensation of tasty. He also has the sense that these are people. Maybe he got that from his sense of sight. And he put the sense of sight and the sense of taste together, and he came up with the judgment, people are tasty. Well, going back to our notes, judgment, which is making a relationship between two terms, that produces the second building block of categorical logic, which is the proposition. Right? The proposition is the statement, usually a sentence, that expresses that relationship between two terms. So the term car, the term red, and then the proposition, the car is red. Right? The term people, the term tasty, and then the proposition, people are tasty. And then from there, Aristotle said that there is one last act of mind, a third act of mind, called inference. And inference is concluding that another proposition necessarily follows from other propositions. And that's the really cool part of the human mind. It can actually take a couple of things it knows and come up with a conclusion all on its own. And for that, let's take a look at our dragon again. So here's the dragon, and he sees this group of people. And in his mind, he's thinking, all people are tasty. He's had that experience before. He looks over and he says, that group is made of people. And then even in his dragon mind, he can come up with the inference, a conclusion from those other two propositions. Well, that must mean that that group is tasty. Now let's actually pause a moment and break that down a little bit further. So you notice in what the dragon was thinking, he really had three terms. He had the term people, he had the term tasty, and he had the term group. Maybe he came to the terms people and group by sight. He had seen people, he had seen groups. Maybe he'd come to the term tasty by actually using his sense of taste and eating things. Those are the terms. Then they get made into propositions as you relate the terms together. All people are tasty, relating the two terms people and tasty. That group is made of people. This time relating the terms group and people. And then finally, you've got the third proposition made up of the terms group and tasty. That group is tasty. And how all that would then flow together is into an argument. So perhaps Mr. Dragon was thinking, since all people are tasty, and that group is made of people, it follows that that group must be tasty. So just to finish up our chart, you see that inference, which is concluding that another proposition necessarily follows from other proposition, that produces the third building block of categorical logic, something we call the argument. So you might want to pause, make sure you have all of those points down, and then we'll just say a final word about that. So as I said, to me that is just amazing when you realize how God created the human mind. And there is a difference between mind and brain. You think about your brain, right? The sloshy gray stuff, it's a little bit wet, it's a little bit, it's oozy, and that stuff is sloshing around in your skull, and it's really made of the exact same stuff as the stuff that's in your fingers, right? It's the same stuff that's in your feet, in your knees. But there's something special going on up here in the brain that gives rise to the mind. And the mind processes what we apprehend through our sight and our hearing, our taste and touch and so forth, and allows us to produce terms. And then that same mind will bring terms together into bring them into some sort of a synthesis, right? Where we can say things like, the car is red, or the perfume smells nice. But then the mind goes even a step further and allows us to make conclusions into a complete argument. So from term to proposition to argument, that's what's going on with those three acts of the mind.